Welcome everybody to a new podcast. And you are listening to a Dutch podcast by the name of Eindbazen. And me and Michel are actually interviewing on a weekly basis the brightest, the best, and the most interesting minds that walk around on the planet Earth. And in this episode, we are interviewing Michael Pollan. Michael was here for a book tour in Amsterdam regarding his new book, How to Change Your Mind. And we talk all about this new movement that's going on surrounding psychedelics. He's done a lot of research. He went into the rabbit hole himself using psychedelics, and we talk about his experiences, our experiences, all the research that has been done about it. And for the psychedelic fans, maybe you're new to it, maybe you're experienced with it, you will love this podcast. Before we go to the podcast, first some sponsor messages. This podcast is sponsored by Synthesis. Synthesis is a Dutch organization that provides personal transformation retreats for forward-thinking individuals who want to utilize psychedelics in a modern, legal, and medically supervised context. I actually know the founders of this organization. I actually spoke with them on an event in the Hoxton in Amsterdam called The Future of Psychedelics. We had a great evening, and I know these guys for a longer period of time. And normally I would be very cautious with these kind of advertisement partners because we are well aware that we might introduce you to something that can change your life for the better. But also, psychedelics are not for everyone. So I've thought about this a lot, and I spoke a lot with the guys from Synthesis. And I truly believe that if I would recommend somebody in the Netherlands for the psychedelic experience, this would be the organization. The way they work is as following. So they offer 3-day psilocybin experiences. This allows you to work on personal goals, to further develop your educational framework on the use of psychedelics. And what they basically offer is a workshop where they provide a safe, intentional, and expert-guided setting where you can have your next breakthrough in your own self-understanding. You can heal all traumas, whatever you're looking for. And, we talk a lot about psychedelics in our podcast. And it's not only the experience itself, there's more to it. And one of the main pros that I think Synthesis is offering is their three phases of working. The first phase is the preparation part. Now, no matter what your intention is, maybe you're there for your creativity on a personal level, maybe you want to work on your personal development, or maybe you're just looking for that mystical experience. It's all possible. And you will have a one-on-one conversation with your lead facilitator to help you clarify your intentions, see what your emotional status is, what your medical history is. And, it's all about getting you comfortable into the psychedelic experience. Obviously, the experience itself is the second phase. And this is where you will consume psilocybin travels with the right dose for you, fully prepared and in a perfectly optimized setting where with the use of music and silence, and you can explore yourself both in inner and outer worlds. And the good thing here is that there will always be facilitators who can support you throughout the experience to aid you whatever you need, providing care and support. And very good to know here is that a medical nurse or a doctor is always on duty in case of emergency. The experience itself, well, it's always a big question mark what it's going to be for you. But I hope it will give you a lot of healing for whatever you're looking for. But one of the most overlooked parts here is the integration part, which is the third phase. And they will help you integrate all the visions, all the feelings, all the thoughts that you had. They will talk about it with you. And basically, they will give you carefully crafted exercises to help you bring the newfound insights back to you and make it into a concrete, meaningful change in your everyday life. So what they want is to prevent that you will walk out with a lot of question marks and basically it's good to talk with people who have actually guided hundreds of people in this process. So definitely check them out at synthesisretreat.com. And also, this podcast is sponsored by Nutrofit. Nutrofit.nl is the web shop of me and Michel, the hosts of this podcast, I have to say. And you can find all kind of nootropic brands there, like Onnit, Bulletproof, Natural Stacks. Go there, nutrofit.nl. Buying supplements there will sponsor the show. And you can use discount code Eindbazen for a 5% discount code. So you guys enjoy this podcast with Michael Pollan. I hope you enjoy it as much as we did. All right, here we are in sunny Amsterdam. For a minute in a hotel room with no one less than Michael Pollan. Thank you for visiting. And
pleasure to be with you.
At the moment, you are on a book tour. You actually wrote a book on a very sensitive subject. Even still in the Netherlands, which is widely known as a very acceptant and free country. But the use of psychedelics is still on the edge for a lot of people. And we thought it was a good idea to start this podcast off by each of us sharing our most profound experience that we had with psychedelics. So I guess I'm going to start with you.
Start with me?
Yeah, okay. Let's go.
Well, for the purposes of this book, How to Change Your Mind, I had several different experiences with different substances. LSD, psilocybin, 5-MeO-DMT, and ayahuasca. And I would say, profound. That was your question, right? Which was the most profound? Yeah. It was a high dose psilocybin trip, guided. I was with a guide who I really trusted, and that's an important part of the story, I think. And I don't know how much of it you want to hear, but it began badly. She put on some music that was just all wrong. It was an artist named Thierry David. I'd never heard of, very new age. I looked him up later on iTunes, and he said he was been nominated 3 times for Best Chill/Groove album. Never won. It was, but this music, as happens, this synesthesia allows you to see the music that you're hearing, right? And it evokes, it brings a landscape into existence. And in this case, it brought up this black and white landscape that was computer generated. It felt computer generated, very digital. And it had all these, it looked like a recording studio with that foam, with the stalactites or stalagmites all over. And I was surrounded by this, and it was like not a happy place to be. And it went on and on and on, and I could not get out of it. And I thought the music was electronica. It turned out not to be, but it sounded to me like electronica, and it was generating this video game landscape. And that's not my thing. I've never been interested in video games, and I really wanted to be outside. I wanted to be in nature, and it went on and on and on. And I argued with my guide, and she changed it. She put on something else, but I could not escape. And there was this mounting kind of claustrophobia. And I thought this trip was really going to go south. So I took off my blindfold. I was wearing an eye mask, and I said I had to use the bathroom, and she helped me get to the bathroom. And while I was in there, I was very careful not to look at the mirror because I know how intense that could be. Somebody in England, when I told the story, said, "Ah, yes, trip face, to be avoided."
Yeah.
And I peed and produced this spectacular crop of diamonds. I thought it was just incredible. I was just so happy to be outside of the computer world and getting light and reality, or whatever passed for reality. And then when I went back she asked me if I wanted a booster. And I said yes. And she was squatting next to me, and she had been transformed when I look at her. She's a very Nordic-looking woman with long blonde hair and high cheekbones. And suddenly she was a Mazatec Indian from Mexico with black hair and leathery brown skin and leathery brown hands, and wearing a white peasant dress. And she was sitting there offering me this mushroom. And I knew exactly who it was. It was Maria Sabina. Mm-hmm. The woman, the Mazatec Indian, who had given the first psilocybin trip to a Westerner in 1955. And I didn't know whether I should tell Mary that she had been transformed into Maria Sabina. I found out later she was flattered, but at the time I didn't know whether she'd like this news. And I took the mushroom from her in this state of things are really getting strange. And after a little while, when it came on, the booster dose came on, something amazing happened. And this was the profound part. And that was that I looked out and I saw myself. I had dissociated from myself, and I saw myself burst into a cloud of little Post-it notes, like 2x2 little pieces of paper just flying in the air, blown around. And I was fine with it. And I don't know who this other I was that opened up, but it was a new perspective that was completely untroubled by what was happening, had no desire to pile all those pieces of paper back into me, and was disinterested, uninvested, objective. And then I looked out again, and I'd been reduced to this pool of liquid spreading out. I was like paint on the landscape. And that was me. That was myself. And I had watched it disintegrate without any sense of anxiety or trouble. And it was fine. It was just, everything was fine. It wasn't great. It was just fine. And then she put on a piece of music we'd agreed to. It was Bach's unaccompanied cello suite in G minor, which is the saddest piece of music you have ever heard. It's gorgeous. And I'd heard it at funerals, actually, so it had already a lot of death association. And I had the most profound experience with music I'd ever had. Of course, I didn't exist as a separate self, so when I heard music, I became music. And there were moments where I could actually feel the bow, the horsehair in the bow going over my skin. It was such a physical experience. Wow. And then I was inside the well of blackness, inside the cello looking out. And it was a mouth, and it was just all merged together. That was an ecstatic experience. In the literal sense, ecstasy in English means to be apart from your body, to be separate. And it was sad. It wasn't like it was happy ecstatic. It was profoundly sad, but it was all about death. But it was about reconciling oneself to death and feeling just fine with that too. So that was my most profound experience. The following day, I went back for my integration session, as you do with a guided trip, and she asked me to tell the story, and I told her the whole story, and she said, well, she said, what was your big takeaway? I said, the big takeaway was that when your ego dies, you don't necessarily die, and that something survives it, and that there was this other way to look at your mind, yourself. And she said, isn't that worth the price of admission? And I said, yes, but I'm back to normal again. I'm back to baseline. My ego is got back in uniform, patrolling the old borders, doing its defensive thing. So what good is it? What good is that experience? Because it's temporary. And she said, well, now that you've sampled that kind of way of being, a different way of being that's less defended, more open, more objective, you can cultivate it. Yeah. And that's been the challenge ever since. How do you cultivate it? And her suggestion was meditation. And meditation is a way to reconnect to those modes of consciousness. I think we can, with work, get ourselves back into that head. And I have found that that experience made me a much better meditator. I kind of have a sense of what I'm trying to do when I'm meditating. Yeah. I know we're not supposed to strive when we meditate, but we do. So I would say I would put that down as my most profound experience, and the one that probably changed me the most.
Powerful.
Yeah. So now your turn.
All right.
Yeah.
You
go ahead, man.
Oh.
Oh. Yeah?
Yeah.
All right. First experience that I had with ayahuasca was about 5 years ago. I got really interested in it, and I actually went to Brazil to train for a month Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I found out about ayahuasca because on the Joe Rogan podcast, I heard Aubrey Marcus talking about it, and I was fascinated by it. Also fascinated by the people who were talking about it, because these guys were way other than the spiritual practitioners that I had in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no hippie bullshit in that, and I really dig that. And at the time, I was very materialistic. Everything was about making money and being successful, and And I was definitely interested in this whole shaman thing and the magic of it, especially with the ayahuasca. In Brazil, for some reason, I didn't have the courage to go into it. So when I got back home, there was a Peruvian shaman traveling through Europe doing a ceremony. So I attended, and I remember sitting there.
Here
in the Netherlands, yeah. So I remember sitting there, and there were like 25 other people, and I was very... and I had an opinion about everyone at the time. Basically, what I was thinking there was like, what are all these fucking hippies doing here? You know, and everybody will. And then we had to do the intentional round where you share your intention. And I heard people talking about, I want to have a better connection with myself. I want to feel the real love, and want to connect with my inner child. And I was like, man, what do I got myself into? Because I actually got there figuring out the name of my new company.
That was your intention.
That was my intention. Yeah,
I love it. Corporate intention.
Corporate intention. And but I felt kind of guilty not having this spiritual intention. So I told everybody, well, my father passed away 2 months after I was born. I never got to know him. So if there's any sign from him, that would be nice. Anyway, ceremony starts, and in 5 minutes, I knew the company name.
You did?
I saw it in a vision, and it was clear to me, okay, this is going to be the company name.
So you got that out of the way.
That out of the way, yeah. And then I went into a very dark and deep experience where I could only feel and see darkness and sadness. And I started crying. I think I cried for 3 hours straight. But I noticed that when I made myself angry from the inside, and I wanted to get rid of the sadness, the darkness kind of faded away into a more light kind of thing. And so I started being really angry about everything what was there, and it really got rid of me. And at one point, I opened my eyes, and I saw myself as a baby. And as a baby, I experienced the pain and the grief that my family endured during the passing away of my father. But as a baby, I was never able to express myself about it. So 6 years later, when you're conscious and you walk around and you talk as a kid, nobody talks about the death of your father anymore. It's not a dinner table conversation. And it really got to me that I saw myself growing up. Basically, you have these books, children books, or if you, I don't know the name in English. If you do like this, you see the
flip books.
Flip books, okay. And I saw myself in a flip book growing up, and I saw myself getting older. And at one point, when I reached the age of about 10 years old, there was a big blue cloud around me, and I just knew that the cloud was my father. And the first thing I asked with my mind was like, why are you a blue cloud?
Blue cloud, yeah.
And that's the first lesson you're going to get. You're always looking for this figure, for this thing to hold on, but the body doesn't say anything. And it's just a spirit that's there, and it's always there. And basically, I had an 8-hour conversation with my deceased dad. He gave me a tour in the afterlife. And after that, there is no fear of death anymore. Obviously, there is fear of death, but not in the way that I had in my system. And I had this whole childhood with a father. I experienced it all over. He learned me all the lessons a father should learn to his son. I had conversations about my girlfriends, about ex-girlfriends, about my jobs, about things that I did miserably wrong. I regretted. All the talks you want to have with your father. And in the end, there was a female shaman and a male shaman, and they did personal healings as well. And when the man was sitting in front of me, he was teaching me everything a man needs to learn about courage, about being strong, and the way of the samurai. And a female shaman, an older shaman, I think she was about 65 years old. She taught me all the things about feminine energy. Being respectful, love, and all that. And basically, I got re-raised in that session. I walked out as a new person. And I think I've been on the couch like this for 3 weeks, trying to figure out what happened to me. But it was one of the most fulfilling experiences that I experienced, and it opened my eyes in many ways. It shattered my world. So that's what got me on the medicine path on that one. Yeah.
That's an amazing story.
Yeah. Your turn, man.
Cloud.
Yeah. Well, I think I have to say that up until now, I've done 2 ayahuasca ceremonies. Still some of the most spiritually profound experiences I ever had. I did 2 nights together with my brother Wiggert here. And well, if you take it into the season right now, I think ayahuasca kind of gave me Christmas spirit back, because I have a past with an alcoholic mother. And we had some nasty incidents during the holidays where mother was drunk.
A hard time. Yeah.
And there were fights. And, well, that kind of takes away the fun for the holidays, because the next time holidays come around, you sort of get anxious about, what's going to happen now? Sure. I hope there's going to be no more fighting. And in my ceremony, I got to experience what it's like to be an alcoholic. So I went into the ceremony going like, there's one topic, I want to see the entire universe, but there's one topic I don't want to breach. And that's that cesspool that's called the trauma of my mother. And well, pretty soon after the ceremony
started. So you had
started,
a non-intention.
I had a non-intention. I was like, I want to see everything except this,
that.
because this is going to hurt, basically. That's what my fear was. It didn't hurt that much, though, because what it did, it showed me what it was like to be an alcoholic. So I was very angry at my mother for not being able to resist the temptation of something that was obviously so very bad for her, and made her, if your entire environment and your family and the people that love you go like, no, don't do this, please, for our sakes, don't do this, and you keep doing it, then you start to resent that person.
Sure.
And by feeling what it was like to have such a strong craving for something, that it dominates your entire worldview, it has such power over you, that I realized there's no way you could have resisted this. This is a monster. And when the moment that realization dawned, I was like, oh, you can resist. This was not your fault. This happened to you as well. And the moment that clicked, there was forgiveness. I could let it go. It was like, well, all this emotion came pouring out. And in doing so, something important happened to me as well, where I could realize, well, I was feeling very responsible for the fact that I couldn't fix her. But then I learned, wow, there was no fixing here.
No fixing to be done.
Yes, and that changed my entire perception of my mom, especially in the final years of her life, and made me reevaluate, for example, going back to Christmas, what happened to her in those moments. So I could view that from an entirely different perspective. And now when Christmas comes around, I can actually miss my mom again. So, yeah, that's my experience.
There's a couple things in there that I really chime with many of the patients I've been talking to, because I've interviewed many people who've used usually psilocybin to conquer addiction. And the extraordinary thing about addiction that you got at is that one's relationship with that bottle transcends every other relationship, including with your children. I mean, how it's unimaginable. But there's this closing down of connection to people. And the only connection is to that substance and the feeling that it gives one. And that what happens to the people having an experience specifically to deal with their own addiction is that they, in the same way you acquired a new perspective on an old problem that you could only see from one direction as the victimized child or the fearful child, suddenly you could see it from her point of view and the alcohol's point of view. And I think it's that perspectival shift that is such a powerful gift of these medicines. And many of the addicts I talked to would say something that was incredibly simple. I remember talking to this one woman who was in a trial at Johns Hopkins University to conquer her addiction to cigarettes. She's a lifelong smoker, Irish woman, 60-ish. She had... and she had this amazing trip, and she said she described sprouting wings and flying through all of European history and visiting all these great scenes. And then she died 3 times, and she saw her smoke rise from a funeral pyre in the Ganges. And she said, and the world was so amazing, and there were so many amazing things to see and do, that smoking just seemed kind of stupid, shortening your life. Why would you want to shorten your life when there's all this out there? And that banal insight allowed her to stop smoking. And so again, she acquired a perspective. But it's not just the perspective, which someone could have told you all that, and someone could have told her smoking is really stupid and it's going to shorten your life. It's the authority that the psychedelic gives the insight. And that's a mystery, I think. William James, writing about mystical experience, which is the best kind of analog in psychology we have for what happens in these experiences, listed the qualities of mystical experience, and it has ego dissolution and merging and transcendence of time and space. But one of the more interesting qualities is what he called the noetic quality. This idea that this is not just an opinion or an insight, this is a revealed truth. And that what you learn is sticky in a way that it would never be otherwise. And it may have to do with the condition your brain is in when you're having that insight and it gets stored in a really, powerful way, or the fact that the distinction between being subjective and objective falls away. So you're less likely to take that insight and say, that's just my opinion, that's just my idea, that's how I felt then, but it's objectively true. Yeah. It's like tablets, stone tablets.
Maybe it's like the fact that it's undeniable now all of a sudden.
Yeah. But what makes it undeniable? That's the thing. I mean, maybe that you had it under the influence of this drug in this context with a shaman and everything, and that's giving authority too, in the same way that what somebody in a white coat with a stethoscope tells us has authority. But this is a deep personal authority.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to start off with these experiences, because whether I really had that conversation with my deceased father is debatable.
Yeah,
for me.
So so afterward, what do you think? I mean,
well, I think it was real, and right now, I am on the path of shamanism and plant medicines and getting more into it. For me, it was definitely real, and it gave me so much that I can't even think. And just what you said, it's the authority, the power of the plant that tells you something, that kind of forces you to have another perspective or be open-minded about it. And it helped me in so many things. I mean, I found out later on in the weeks after of integrating, maybe years integrating, that I was really insecure. And as a result of being insecure, you're going to act more tough, and you're going to be a loudmouth, and right. All this chasing success and money was a product of that. And the same with your mother with addictions. Like, what triggers an addiction? There's something's hurt from the inside.
Yeah, there's probably some trauma there,
and it causes you to smoke, to sedate yourself or whatsoever. Right. And this is such an it's very precious, and it's very complicated.
Tell me, was your mother still alive after you had this experience? Yeah. Did you talk to her about it?
About this experience? Yeah.
How'd that go down?
Interesting. Yeah, I actually had that conversation, and my mom is not a particularly spiritual person, but she understands that some people could be more sensitive or see stuff or hear stuff, feel stuff, and she's obviously fascinated by my stories. I mean, right now it's 80 ayahuasca sessions further and going to the forest, and
8 or 80?
80, yeah.
80. Wow.
I mean, and I love it. I'm writing books about it, and I still the more I do it, the less I figure out. Yeah, definitely. And the never one session has been the same. But actually talking to her, I was very aware of what she was doing, and I was talking to her, and there was this. She was silent. She was very listening to what I was telling, and I saw her fingers going on the way, like I was definitely touching a subject, and she never questioned it.
I'll imagine how that was for her.
She saw the transformation for me. And I had a conversation. My father also asked, like, "Hey, how's your mother doing?" And a funny thing, you were telling about some things you don't want to talk about. My brother is diagnosed with schizophrenia. So I grew up in a household from my 10th till my 21st in daily domestic violence, from physical violence to just verbal abuse and stuff. And to be honest, at the time, we didn't know my brother had a mental condition, and it developed and it got worse over time. So at one point, definitely a thing of my ego, I was so done with it. I cut contact in any way with my brother. So I didn't see him for 10 years. During that conversation with my father, I kind of felt he was going through the list of persons connected to my family, and he was asking like, "How is he doing? And how's that going?" And I kind of felt it's like, "Oh no, I don't want to go here." Yeah. And he's like, "Well," I was like, "This is such a beautiful night, and I'm so loving and so grateful. Please don't go there." He's like, "Okay, I'm gonna leave it for now. Next time you will be here, I want you to work on it because it will get to you someday." And that's the moment where I started thinking about why did I cut the contact with my brother. And 3 years later, I had reconnected with him, and it was a lot of forgiving and also a better understanding. Plant medicine also made me understand better. Same as for your mother, it wasn't the choice of my brother to become schizophrenic. Yeah. And these I still get goosebumps from talking about it. So only these two profound experiences have done so much for me in a way to look at people, be more loving, more forgiving, and don't take anything personal about it.
Yeah, that's amazing. Mm-hmm. I'm curious about doing 80 ceremonies. Mm-hmm. You got so much from the first. Okay, I understand why you'd want to do it again. But what are you learning on the 75th and 76th?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. I get this question a lot. I know that I am very comfortable in the world of ayahuasca. When I drink the medicine, I have a very comfortable feeling, even with my most darkest things that I encounter, my fears or the darkest parts of me. I'm very comfortable in facing them. I know the territory. I feel I can move around. I'm not out of this world for a long time, and that's also what got me on the path of shamanism. Right now, I'm being an apprentice of a tribe leader in the Amazon. Did a dieta there, spending 40 days in solitary, doing the dieta and drinking a lot of the medicine. And it made me so much aware about everything in my body, in my mind, about other people, how I look at the world, and so it's ever evolving. And I also found out that in every stage there are new things to learn. For example, I just became a father. There's a whole new spectrum of emotions and things and problems and that you create yourself and that you think about. Basically, you as a person change, and with you, your problems and emotions are changing. Mm-hmm. And I guess in every stage of life, there is more to explore. And to be honest, I'm an excited psychonaut. I really love that realm.
But you're also in training.
I'm also in training.
To be able to lead other people.
And this was really interesting to me. And I heard you talking about this with Joe Rogan, and it got to my mind. The first time I did psychedelics was mushrooms when I was 16 years old. And we did it just to get high. Mm-hmm. So what was the result? Everybody got high, saw things moving and coloring, and that was kind of the experience. No profound insights, no spiritual experiences. And then later on, going in with the intention, okay, this is a spiritual practice. The spiritual practices appeared. And later on...
Intentions, everything.
Yeah, and later on, being an apprentice of the shaman, I remember my first ceremony with him. I was an assistant, and I actually told him, like, listen, I'm kind of nervous because what do I know? I mean, you've been drinking this since you were 2 years old, 3 times a week sometimes, and you're 50 years old. Yeah. That's thousands of sessions. And he's like, don't worry, the medicine will take care of it. And the moment it started, the medicine didn't treat me as a patient, but as someone who is helping other people with it. So, and then at that point, the medicine is actually guiding you to work with people, what to do, and it's spot on every time. That's fascinating. I love it.
So the focus now is different. It's on the people around you.
Yeah, you still get your own personal healings about it, and I also found that other people can definitely mirror you. Yeah, and so that's I truly believe that other people and the process heal you in a way as well. Mm-hmm. That's why I think sharing after ceremonies is such an important thing. You can learn so much from it. these insights. Yeah,
Fascinating.
yeah, it's really special.
Did it change your own spirituality in that sense? I heard you say on another podcast, a bit loaded term maybe, but spiritually retarded. Has that in any way changed after doing these investigations?
Yeah, I mean, it changed my understanding of what spirituality was. I think I had a misunderstanding of what spirituality was. I had always assumed that spiritual was a synonym for supernatural, and the people who were spiritual believed in supernatural things, an afterlife, an underworld, a spirit realm, all these kind of things. And I didn't. That seemed very far from my understanding of the world, which was very kind of straight ahead philosophical materialist, that everything could be explained according to the laws of nature that we knew or ones we would discover. And so I was allergic to spirituality in that sense. When I had this experience, the one I'm explaining and some of the others, I had another psilocybin experience that was very much about nature and about the natural world and getting a very powerful sense that the plants had their own kind of consciousness, they had their own subjectivity, their agency. They were actors on us as well as us on them. They weren't mere objects. And this powerful sense of connection with plants, which I had always had intellectually. I've written a lot about plants, and I have an enormous respect for their intelligence. I really do believe they have intelligence, not in the way we do, but they have the same kind of problem-solving ability, that they can deal with the challenges life throws at them in a creative way.
I get the sense they're moving at another pace.
Well,
like they're in slow motion, and we're just really
I think
fast
that's true. I
whizzing
think,
by.
and that's why when you ever see, great time-lapse photography of plants, you develop a much greater respect for their. I mean, watch a bean do its thing and figure out how to find the light and how to, get climb and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I've had that as an intellectual understanding, but I never really felt it at a deep emotional level, and I did on this experience. And then I had other experiences where I felt this dam break of love for people in my life, especially for my wife and my son, and I came to understand that spirituality really is about those connections getting very strong, about opening to this flow from other beings, whether they're people or nature or the universe, and that I had misunderstood spirituality, and that what keeps us from feeling that way all the time is our defenses, our ego defenses, and that we build these walls to protect us from strong feelings, from our sense of oneness with nature. Being able to objectify the other is very powerful. You become very successful as whether you're a corporate executive or a farmer. I mean, if you just kind of treat nature as an object that you can exploit, that gives you a certain power. Ditto with other people. So our egos are very interested in objectifying everything but us. And maybe we'll let in the circle of our loved ones, but everybody else is just, a means to an end. Yeah. And the ego is very tough that way. Yeah. And so it's really when you let go of the ego that you have this connection. And I came to understand spirituality is the opposite of spiritual is not supernatural or is not material. The opposite of spirituality is egotistical. And to the extent you're egotistical, you're not spiritual. And to the extent you can let that go and open up those valves, as Aldous Huxley called them, that is what spiritual experience is. Yeah. So for me, it's still not a supernatural thing in any way, but I have a new understanding of it. And I owe that to these experiences, especially with psilocybin. Yeah. So I feel more spiritually developed. That's my own definition of spirituality. It's not going to be everybody's. I think some people for whom spirituality is, in your case, you communicated with someone who's not alive, and that's spiritual experience for you. Yeah. I haven't had that. People have been very present to me who weren't alive, but I had no reason to believe that they weren't projections of my own mind. It's funny. My dad died in January, and his sickness was a real background to the writing of this book in a way. My interest in how people who are dying think about death, and the volunteers I talked to who'd had these experiences was very much a substitute for a conversation I couldn't really have with my dad, who I still don't know how he processed his imminent death.
Yeah.
He was in denial a lot of the time. He had some dementia, so he was forgetting it. You know, he'd have to be reminded sometimes that he was dying. So that conversation never happened, but I was able to have it with other people. But anyway, I've been very curious to know. I haven't had another experience since I published the book, or even since I finished writing it, pretty much, whether he would figure in the next experience, which I think he might well. And part of me is eager for that, to keep his memory really alive and fresh.
Yeah.
And part of me is terrified of that. So, you know, you're talking about how you're always changing, and the experience, the journeys you have will reflect where you are in your life. And I'm in a different place now with the loss of my dad, and I have no doubt that it would play some role in the next.
Well, I'm just wondering, what would be terrifying about it?
I don't know. Good question. I don't know why I felt that way. But an encounter with the dead has some terror attached. You're going to learn something about death. Maybe you learn something reassuring about death. You say you lost your fear of death.
Death is a particular subject, and it can be taught in many ways. I mean, for example, I had a very loving experience. I know from another example from a woman who died 3 times during that night. She experienced the same death as her daughter, in order to understand it better and to know.
Her daughter had died.
Her daughter had died, and she died her death 3 times in order to understand it and make peace with it. And it's a weird way of teaching, you would think, but it's a way.
Painful way of teaching, but it is a way of teaching.
When on the topic of death, if you look at when you're investigating this, what is it exactly that the psychedelics conquer in these patients that are end of life? So I have ayahuasca helped me with my fear of death as well. But before that, I remember nights where I was laying awake at night. One day I'm going to die. One day this is just going to stop, and I'm going to be lying in this bed. Something's going to happen. I'm not going to, and it's just the end of it. And I feared that moment because it would mean the end of me. And I think this is common in other people, but still it's a fact that once people do psilocybin or ayahuasca, that fear sort of diminishes. And if you look at all the people you interviewed about that, what exactly is it that it tackles?
You know, it was different in different people. I mean, some people really had a vision of an afterlife, and they peered over an edge, and they saw this great plane of consciousness or great plane of love, and that's where they were going. And I don't know how they understood that their consciousness would somehow survive their bodily death. Others had a very kind of weirdly naturalistic idea. I remember this one woman was describing her trip, and she was one of the cancer patients, and she was traveling underground, and she very freely through the ground, she was dematerialized in some way, and she hit a wall, and that wall was a crematorium, and she realized she was dying. She was dead. But she didn't feel dead. She didn't feel pain or anything. She wasn't burning up, but she was, and then she felt herself disintegrate and be taken up by the plants. Now, this is what happens, actually, to some people. You decompose, and your molecules become part of another life form. So it was a perfectly naturalistic description of an afterlife, yet she was able to identify with those molecules in a way, and felt like she was still present in some sense. So some of it is changing your definition of what a self is, from this bag of bones to something more dematerialized and abstract. For other people, I think it really was, I'm assuming, the kind of experience I had, that there was, after I saw myself, my conventional sense of myself dissolve into liquid, that something survived it. And that something, I don't know what it was, but some people interpret that as a more universal consciousness. Aldous Huxley called it the mind at large. He felt like his self was gone, but there was this mind at large that he was seeing experience from, and that mind at large was a transpersonal category. I didn't come to that conclusion. I sort of assumed that this other perspective, I had somehow generated it. But people who are dying may take another interpretation, which is essentially that the death of their ego was a practice for death, a rehearsal, and that something survives it.
Yeah.
And it's that disembodied, objective, because that consciousness, that point of view I had wasn't so me, wasn't entirely me. It took part of something larger than me.
Yeah.
So I think that's where the comfort is, that yourself is not the whole deal.
I think the big fear is annihilation.
Annihilation, complete annihilation.
I think that's the
Yeah.
fear. If I look at it myself, one of the lessons my visions taught me is that you go through iterations, but your sort of your essence remains, and you're connected to all these other essences, and
Right.
you keep touching each other through iterations. And that was like, oh, so I'm not completely gone, and that gave
Right.
me assurance.
That's a huge comfort.
Yes,
And we don't know what that is. That may be a pure illusion spun by the mind, or it might be an important insight. I'm still agnostic on that question. I mean, I asked the doctors when I first started. The first piece I wrote that became part of the book was an article for the New Yorker on these trials of giving psilocybin to people who had cancer, most of whom were terminal. Some were not terminal, but were disabled by their fear of recurrence. And I would ask the doctors when I talked to these people, and they had this new confidence that something would survive their death, and that they'd taken enormous comfort. I said, "Aren't you concerned that maybe you're just feeding people delusions?" And they had a variety of answers that were interesting, not entirely satisfying, but interesting. I remember one saying, "Well, that's beyond my pay grade. I mean, we don't know what happens after you die. Who am I to say? This is their conclusions. We haven't given them, and it's true. The drug doesn't contain a conclusion about anything.
Yeah.
As you know, it's a unspecific mental amplifier, or whatever it is. And others said, and someone else said, I don't care if this allows people to die with equanimity, surrounded by their loved ones. Who cares? And of course, we've had another potential illusion called religion. That nobody argues about. I mean, these are narratives people have that help them through these difficult times. And so somebody took a very pragmatic view, and I was hungry to have the kind of like, well, let's nail this down metaphysically. But of course, we can't.
Maybe we could though. Maybe we could, because I've been listening to some of the podcasts you've been on, and I was very pleasantly surprised to hear your also Paul Stamets.
Sure, very well.
About the mycelium network, and you were talking about plant consciousness and the mind at large. And what I found interesting about the experience you described about the woman dissolving sort of into, the earth and the molecules spreading.
Yeah.
I was wondering how you feel about the following, like plant consciousness and human consciousness, and the spiritual insight that you had that we're just a part of a bigger connection, and our ego are just the walls between these connections. How do you feel about the premise that we might actually be connected through everything through this mycelium network, that could actually be sort of the network that all this persistence of consciousness goes through? Because if you look at a human body, I forgot the title of the book, but I think it was like 10%. It basically describes how you as a human are influenced by a whole lot of things like bacteria,
Microbiome,
fungi, parasites,
Right.
stuff like that, which could all explain certain behaviors, which is all linked into the bigger network where food comes from and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that might be something that could actually explain the bigger connections, in our little mental walls. The ego are just illusions, but if you look at it from a bigger distance, it's kind of hard not to see it as a bigger picture.
Well, I mean, I think it's true that we are part of this network, and the idea that we're separate beings is the delusion. I mean, we depend on, we have no existence individually. We cannot survive alone for very long, and that without the plants that we depend on for food, and without the bacteria we depend on to adjust our body chemistry and run our immune system, we don't survive. So the idea that we're part of a larger network of forces is, we know that's scientifically true. How that involves consciousness, though, which is really what you're talking about, and communication, information, is what we don't know. we don't know if information has an independent existence in the world outside of us. And I think that's kind of the big question. Is consciousness a product of brains, pure and simple, or is it a property of the universe that is, there's some physicists who believe that any complex enough system will acquire consciousness, and that it's just a matter of it arises, it's emergent with a certain level of complexity. When I say plants are conscious or mycelium are conscious, I don't mean it I think, as most people understand the word consciousness. And the word is, you have to be careful with the word, because it can mean something, at least in English, as simple as to be aware of your environment. As a plant is. A plant knows whether the sun is shining on it, or whether a pest is chewing on its leaf, or whether it's getting water from its roots. It's taking in information in a way and processing it and then acting accordingly. It has some memory. There's some amazing studies that suggest that plants have some memory too. But when we think of consciousness as a human experience, we're thinking more about self-consciousness. That the fact that we can be aware that we're aware, the fact that there's a particular quality to the experience of being you that is very real to you and not very real to anybody else. And science hasn't penetrated that mystery at all. There's a famous essay by Thomas Nagel, "What is it like to be a bat?" If it's like anything to be a bat, in other words, if there's any quality to bat experience, the bat has consciousness. What is it like to be a plant is the next and harder question. And I don't know how to answer that because the plant world is just, and the mycelial world is just, the animal world we can kind of infer things from, right? I mean, we see how they react to pain and stimulus, positive or negative. Plants, it's a lot harder to know how they're dealing with us or anything else. So I guess I just don't have enough to go on there. I'm respectful of the mystery and less arrogant that that science can answer this. I mean, the more I'm a science journalist, and this book stays as close as it can to science for most of its length. One of the reasons I didn't explore, for example, the shamanic side of psychedelics, except in a very brief way, or microdosing, is that in both cases, I wanted to be able to point to science to bring a certain kind of reader along who is really allergic to mysticism and these kind of questions, and because I was too at the beginning, but so I don't know how we can be definitive about that. And when Paul Stamets, who I think is a brilliant and visionary person, says that mycelium are bringing us a message from nature, I don't know exactly how to interpret that. I don't know what that means exactly. I mean, how metaphorical is that, or how literal is that? Or that there, and his idea that there's an internet underground. In a sense, there is, because there is this stuff is being communicated, goods are being traded, nutrients are being traded around. That the forest is a lot more networked than we thought. And that's kind of amazing. And that an idea, when he first articulated that, when I first heard it, I thought was just a nice conceit, a poetic conceit. But in fact, it's more literally true than I thought. So I try to keep my mind open. Some people push back on the book. How to Change Your Mind, I got much less pushback than I ever expected. I mean, I was worried about legal pushback. I was worried about, from the psychiatric community. I just thought I was going to get a world of shit for this book. And I didn't. I mean, that was kind of amazing. But I did get some pushback from an unexpected quarter, which is people who believe in transpersonal consciousness. And many people in the psychedelic community come out of their experiences convinced that consciousness is outside us and we tune it in, or I entertain that idea. I don't really have anything definitive, but my prejudice tends to be that no, consciousness, the simplest explanation is our brains produce it, even though we have no idea how that happens. And science is pretty far from understanding that. So, so I heard from some of those people, and they were essentially urging me to read this or that and explore that idea, which I'm totally open to exploring. I mean, I think humility is one of the important things that psychedelics teaches us, that we don't know everything, and that the world is more complicated and bigger, and the mind is bigger than we appreciate.
Yeah. I've asked this question a lot of times during my ayahuasca sessions to get an answer to this, like how does it all work? And many times I got the same answer.
Please, after 80, tell us.
We have another 4 hours. I brought my notebook. Now, a few times I had a few funny experiences. One was it's unexplainable. Your brain wouldn't even able to fit it in to understand it.
Well, that theory that the human brain is not capable of understanding the human brain makes a certain intuitive sense.
Yeah, and then the second lesson was that I saw the whole world. I saw the clouds breaking open. I saw this big clockwork, like you look in the inside of an expensive watch. And everything in there was there. All the wheels, the things that go on. And everything in this universe was arranged in there. From collective consciousness to your character. From my place of birth to where I would die. And everything was arranged and connected and interconnected. And for a moment, I figured it out. I saw it all.
Damn.
And then,
written it down.
and then it went on, and I remember during a vision, like, how I'm gonna remember this? I have to explain it, and now I'm writing it in a book, and it's so hard to grasp. And that was one of the big lessons. Like, it's too complex for you to understand. Why would you even want to understand?
I think that's there's a lot of sanity in that. Good luck describing all that. It's the challenge, in writing this book. One of the biggest challenges was, how do you describe a psychedelic journey to someone who hasn't had one?
Yeah,
and it's an interesting literary challenge.
I made the decision to take people on my journey, which makes it easier to describe. In your case, you want to do it more scientifically. For me, it's just my journey. And,
that's what it is in the book too. There's a long travelogue section where I describe I just tell the stories of my journeys. But you'll see it's not easy to do in a way that either doesn't make you sound like a lunatic, or
I got over that a long time, and I actually, it was funny when I got back from the forest, I got invited into a national TV show, and I did a dieta, and I felt everything, like from that plant that taught me everything, and I came back from the forest, went on national television, and I was proud to talk about it. I was excited to talk about it. But along the way, I had 10 minutes to talk about it, and they asked like certain questions. And basically I told people I went on this thing in isolation where you go in a relationship with a plant surrounded by Indians. And like, well, the plant medicine community loves it.
Yeah, but not other people.
Yeah, the big people, they were just like, you're talking to a plant, you're crazy, And right. And it also, that in the end, for me, it was a big lesson. If you want to spread your message to the world, you have to write it differently. You have to package it in a certain way. And
what I was really trying to write a book that that would reach people in the community, but reach many more people outside of the community. There have been very few books on psychedelics that were for the general reader. And so I wasn't satisfied with telling the story in a way that, I would have a lot of people nodding, who were associated with the community. I was happy to, since I've had a lot less experience than a lot of people in the community, I was very happy that those people have wanted to read the book, but I've been more gratified to know that I've reached people who have no experience of these medicines and now are very curious. And then I've reached all the people, all the parents of the people who like to do psychedelics, it's a way for the children, the psychonaut children, to explain to their parents what they've been up to.
Well, I'm happy you explained the part about why you didn't dive into the shamanism, because that was definitely something that I missed in your book. I also saw.
I'm very curious about it, and I've definitely explored ayahuasca. I've been in a couple circles and want to look at it more deeply. But I I barely described those trips, even though they were really interesting. I just felt like the book didn't need another trip. It's just my sense of pace as a writer, but there were some powerful images that came out of the ayahuasca trips.
You will dive into the mystics of things, though, if you go into the indigenous communities.
Yeah.
And because for
and
example,
I didn't travel to South America or anything for the book.
For example, like if you talk about consciousness outside of us, like every tribe has its own vision about it, and plants talking. And I remember, for example, asking the tribe leader about cannabis. They were smoking it a lot. And he told me, like, well, you have to smoke this for 5 to 10 years, multiple times a day, and it will get you a relationship with the plant that makes you more sensitive, and it will guide you in order to heal somebody else if he's ill. And one of the most interesting things now, having this conversation, it kind of lands that I had to drink a lot of ayahuasca in order to make a better connection with another plant. So
yeah, that's interesting.
Going into this dieta with the intention to connect with one plant, and we were talking about the intention, like why are you going to do this? Then you kind of find out that they have all these different plants that can teach you different stuff, and
many we haven't heard of, right? I mean, I know.
Yeah.
I have a student who's doing a dieta, and he was doing like a tree in Berkeley. I forget what it was, a cypress or something. That that he was having this ongoing relationship with, and they're not all psychoactive, as you know.
Definitely not.
I think
no.
that's really interesting.
It's
but they all have a different.
Yeah, it's even interesting, like how my diet started. I asked him, like, how do you want me to start a diet? He's like, pick a leaf, rub it all over your body. I was disappointed. That was it.
And you chose the leaf.
No, he didn't. He did. Yeah, a leaf from a plant, and there I was in the middle of the jungle talking to a plant, introducing myself, asking for help. That was the assignment. And then I walked back to him. He's like, okay, your diet has started. And I couldn't believe it. And yeah, it definitely started. And it's a long story on itself. But the saying that they always have, like, why did you get this information? Well, the plants taught us. And his vision is like, well, the plants were way long before than any of us. So they know everything. Mm-hmm. All the technology's in there. And yeah, that's something I love the mystic about it as well. I think it's a fascinating subject. Mm.
Something I find mysterious about it is that, and perhaps you can share some insight on this, is that we through the podcast, we share our experiences. A lot of people come back with experiences. I've listened to my fair share of podcasts about the topic. And one thing I notice is that there seems to be a similarity across experiences. So if you go to the ayahuasca universe, there's a lot of people that report octopods, for example, snake-like figures, and the jaguar is a theme, and a condor is a theme. And I was always wondering, where do you think that comes from? Is that like a bias? For example, I heard him talk about, and now I take this into my experience. But at the same time, I've had experiences that I never heard about, that I started Googling after my first ceremony, and lo and behold, I'm not the only one. There are more people that had this. Yeah. So
I think that's a fascinating question. I mean, some of it is power of suggestion. I mean, these are incredibly suggestible drugs. So, for example, among the academic researchers in America, about 3/4 of people have a mystical experience, that they would use that word to describe, and it matches the standard of what a mystical experience is. In England, they don't have mystical experiences the same way. So why should that be? Why should there be a difference? Well, the American researchers tend to be more spiritual. The man who really started it, the Renaissance in America, Roland Griffith, who I profile at length in the book, he got interested in psychedelics because he had a mystical experience in his Hindu meditation. So that's his orientation, and he is somehow communicating that to people. It's reflected in the playlist. The music that they play has a kind of spiritual cast to it. There's a lot of choral music, and I mean, I listened to it when I was writing the book, and it was like, yeah, this is kind of priming someone for a spiritual experience. In England, they're a little more allergic to that vocabulary, and so they talk about ego dissolution instead of mystical experience. I would argue those are just different words for the same phenomenon, that when you experience ego dissolution, what follows is the kind of merging I described, which you can interpret as a mystical experience very easily. All the aspects of the mystical experience could follow theoretically from a loss of ego. Now, ego dissolution just sounds more scientific to us. You know, it's Freudian vocabulary that in the West we're more comfortable with. There's nothing wrong with the other vocabulary, but but people. So some of the imagery is a function of that. In the case of ayahuasca, I would add the fact that you feel the medicine in your body in a way you don't with LSD or psilocybin. That you have this sense of I didn't get sick, but I was highly aware that my body had been occupied by a medicine and it was disturbing it in some ways. And the twisting of your intestines and the twisting of a vine are very easy to kind of conflate. And I did have imagery of vines. And we know the ayahuasca, one of the two plants is a vine, a liana. And so that's part of it. But then you get to something like DMT, where everybody sees these entities that are very specific, the machine elves.
Yeah.
Now, I haven't done that or...
Have you been on the operation table?
Well, no.
Operated by aliens?
No, that hasn't happened yet, but it happens to a lot of people. Now, if you really want to test this, you've got to find a naive population, right, culturally, because they are looking at the entities. There is a study going on at Imperial College where they're giving people DMT to see what, how common the imagery is.
Yeah, that's great.
But they're all giving them to people in England who may have been exposed to this mythology that you see entities. My guess is before Terence McKenna started talking about entities, fewer people saw them, but I could be wrong. So there's a way to test this, though. And maybe they're going to quiz people. You don't want to say, have you heard about the entities? But there's another question you could ask that would not plant the idea in their head. But we have to be sensitive to the fact that, as you found with your intention, and you found with your non-intention, that as soon as the idea is in play, your brain is going to go there and use it. And so I did have more plant imagery and vine imagery on ayahuasca, but I always attribute it to the myths of that and the physicality of the experience.
Yeah.
Well, what I found interesting about it is that my girlfriend did a ayahuasca ceremony recently, and she had no prior knowledge of the experiences. Of course, I talked a little bit about mine, but mine were excluded of jaguars, condors, and snake. I had visions, but none of those. And she very specifically mentioned those, which was like, how do you know these things? It's so typically ayahuascan. So,
but she knows it's from the Amazon, right?
Maybe that's it. Yeah, sure.
I mean, this stuff is in the air. So anyway, I think it's a great question to study. And now it also could be archetypes, right? I mean, Jungian archetypes. Certain, he points out that our dream imagery has commonalities. Yeah. And where does that come from? We may inherit some software, not just hardware.
Did you, in that regard, look into the myths of DMT at all? Like, for example, one of the urban myths that surrounds DMT is that you produce it when you, for example, when you die or you go to sleep.
That's right.
Dreamlike imagery.
And tiny amounts are produced in the pineal gland. And I did look into that, and I didn't find anything satisfying. The amounts are minuscule. But it's very hard to study chemicals in the brain because you can't sample the brain. You can sample the cerebral fluid, or you can do it in animals. And they have found in rats a tiny amount of DMT produced in the pineal gland for purposes we don't know. Yeah. The theory, which may be urban legend, is that it gets released or produced in great quantities in order to deal with, dreaming or near-death experience or something. And a near-death experience is another example of something where people have remarkably similar experiences of, seeing a white light and separating from their body and all these kind of things. And there may be some psychedelic compound that gets released at moments of crisis, but there's no good evidence yet that it's DMT. DMT is one of the steps in the production of melatonin, actually. I think tryptophan is an essential amino acid that we need in our diet, and as the pineal gland turns that into melatonin, it passes through DMT. I think don't quote me on the science of that, but it's an interesting idea. I mean, in general, we learned with cannabis we have receptors for the cannabinoids. Why do we have them? Well, because there's an endogenous cannabinoid. Our body is producing something that interacts with those receptors. In the case of the psychedelics, they seem to interact with these 5-2A receptors. But we know the endogenous neurotransmitter is serotonin that interacts with the same thing. So whether there's an actual psychedelic in the brain remains to be seen. It's a really interesting question.
So what do you think of the if you go into dark for a long time, like complete dark for a few days, your melatonin production shuts down. And I'm not really sure if this is like science based, but what I've heard is that DMT starts flowing. That's where people get mystical experience. They heard a word from God or whatsoever. It happened in many cultures. You have any opinion about that one?
No, I never heard that.
Wow.
I'll look into it.
Yeah, it's like, well, and the other thing I was thinking about, well, if you go into complete dark for a long while and there's no impulses from outside, your brain starts producing.
You do have psychedelic experience. I mean, the flotation tanks, right?
Exactly.
I mean, there's one right down the street
I
here.
was about to say it, yeah.
And I was actually curious to try it, and I don't have, because I'm spending my day with people like you. I haven't had a chance to try it.
It's open until 10, so you can go.
Open till 10?
Yeah.
I'm speaking till 10. So there are many ways to achieve a state of what we would call psychedelic consciousness. And meditators get there too sometimes, right? They have experiences of ego dissolution, very experienced meditators. We now know that their brains in a scanner look very similar to psychedelic brains in a scanner. In other words, the same brain network, the default mode network, which is really the home of the sense of self, is shut down or goes offline on psychedelic experience. And also experienced meditators, same exact thing happens. I have no doubt that if you could remove all sensory stimuli, you would hallucinate. And the reason is that the brain is constantly trying to make sense of its environment. Yeah. And most of what we see are projections of the brain, not it's most of perception is a controlled hallucination. Our brain's taking the minimum amount of information they need to like see that that's a human with a face and a head, and that's another one, and then projects that. Makes a prediction. Yeah. So when we have uncertainty about the outside world, we will project meaning onto it. Yeah. So on psychedelics, this gets overactive. So you project faces on the clouds or in the rain. And one of the things psychedelics do is mess with that process. What's called predictive coding. And so in the absence of stimuli, the brain will produce its own. It needs to keep telling stories. So I wouldn't be surprised at all that it happens. But I don't know that you need a psychedelic for that to happen. I mean, whether the brain would need to produce a psychedelic in order to produce these predictions, I don't know.
A lot of people telling me like, do you really need that, Ayers? Do you know that you can have these experiences without using psychedelics? I was like, yeah, I'm sure you can, but I like it. You know?
Well, that's somebody who was interviewing me was saying that. It's like, well, wouldn't it be better to do this through meditation? And I said, well, one way to think about psychedelics is they're a shortcut. Yeah. And what's wrong with a shortcut? Especially you Dutch, you're so into efficiency, right? Why take the long way around? Yeah. But she was insisting. And the reason is that we have this kind of Protestant work ethic that if you don't work at it, you haven't earned it. You haven't earned the state of consciousness.
I think they have the wrong perception of a psychedelic trip.
Yes, there's a lot of work.
It's hard work.
It's very hard work, and it's just short. It's condensed, whereas meditation is hard work over years. And but I run into this all the time, that it's cheating. It's a kind of mental cheating, and I don't buy that. I mean, the idea that a chemical that comes from outside is less legitimate than a chemical that comes from inside. Yeah. I think in a way it's more remarkable that a plant is producing a chemical that changes your consciousness. Yeah. That's the remarkable thing, that we have enough in common with the plant world that the chemistry that is floating around that world can float through us also and change things. I mean, that's pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm. And how far are we different from any fungal?
Well, we're closer to mushrooms than we are to plants. Yeah. No, we are. Well, think about it. I mean, plants are what's called primary producers. They can take sunlight and through photosynthesis create food, sugars. Yeah. And we can't do that. We can't take energy directly from the sun, and either can mushrooms. Like us, mushrooms depend on the products of plants. They eat decomposing plants, or they decompose plants, and we cook them and do other things with them. So we're both dependent on the plants in the same way.
Yeah, that's so fascinating.
Yeah. One more question about the default mode network and the neuroscience behind the psychedelics. It's something I just heard you say about that our brain is very good at filtering out information. And I think I heard it say that one of the things that psychedelics actually do is suppress certain areas so that more comes in. Is that true?
Yes. So consciousness is basically doing as much to eliminate inputs than anything else, because too much is coming at us at any given time. Mm-hmm. You have to edit out so much peripheral noise, peripheral vision. All your senses are active, and you're tuning most of them out in order to listen to what I'm saying. And we're constantly doing that, and we would be overwhelmed by information if we could take in anything. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that consciousness does so is reduce that input to a manageable stream that's narrow. And attention does that too. Whereas children, for example, our consciousness is like a spotlight. Mm-hmm. Children's consciousness is like a lantern. Mm-hmm. So we can illuminate one thing. We can have a conversation, and we blocked out so many things about our lives and the world to have this conversation. Kids don't. It's all coming in. They're getting it from all sides. That's why they can't focus. That's why they're useless in school until they get to be before 6. There's no ability to focus.
It's because of the beta brainwave that they're continuously in, right?
Is it? I don't know. It might be.
I mean, the receptive state of your mind for the first 7 years.
And then the alpha waves take over.
Just downloading.
Yeah. Well, they're learning, right? They're developing their predictive coding, and so the role of the default mode network, though, is sort of an editor of the brain, and it's a regulator. I mean, Robin Carhart Harris calls it the orchestra conductor, or the corporate executive, or the capital city. It kind of keeps everything in order and decides what's going to come in, what's not going to come in, what you're going to pay attention to, whether you're going to access memories and emotions or not, all this kind of stuff. So you take that offline, and 2 things happen. More internal information is accessible to consciousness. Subconscious, memory, trauma, all these things bubble up that normally are kept repressed. Mm-hmm. And then outside information too. More outside information comes in, and we have these powerful sensory experiences. And it depends. That's one of the reasons if you wear an eye shade or you do an experience at night, you're going to bring in less information from the environment and more from inside you. So the eye shade is a remarkably powerful technology, actually, in psychedelic experience, I think. The difference between having it on and having it off is like changing the channels. It's amazing.
And if we look at the therapeutic value of psychedelics, and we notice that it actually, opens up certain filters and it shuts down the default mode network, mm-hmm. What does that accomplish that allows us to go to trauma or certain behavioral patterns that we want to break with or engage in? Well, what happens? Why are we so more malleable?
Well, because basically when you take the orchestra conductor away, the patterns, so many of the patterns that enforce destructive behavior, destructive thought, as you see in depression, anxiety, obsession, addiction, these are all loops, stuck in these ruminative loops. And that takes place in the default mode network. That's where self-reflection happens. That's where self-criticism happens. Mm-hmm. You take that away and you're temporarily freed from all those patterns. Mm-hmm. And that's when, because your brain is temporarily rewired, because all the other parts of the brain start talking to each other without going through the default mode network. You suddenly have direct communication between your visual cortex and your memory or your emotions. So you see things you fear or desire. And that temporary rewiring allows you to break those patterns. They'll come back, but they won't be as strong. And basically, you're exercising new neural pathways. And that's why remembering your trips can be really useful, because you're reinforcing those new networks. Mm. But basically, it's getting you out of that head, that ego-driven head of self-recrimination and self-obsession and letting in the light and letting in the air, whether it's coming from deep within you or outside. And that seems to be what allows people. Now, these are theories. I mean, we don't We don't know exactly, but there's a plausible connection between what's going on at the brain level and what's going on at the phenomenological level.
Yeah, it sounds like you're more. It's more easy to make those paradigm shifts that we talked about when we were talking about the experiences. That all of a sudden you can see it from the other one's perspective, and it's like, oh, so
Because
that's why
we're trapped. We're trapped in a very narrow perspective.
Yeah.
It's the one that we are the default we go to all the time,
Yeah.
and that default is in the default mode network. And giving that a rest. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that people with depression, for example, have overactive default mode networks. So they're wandering in their minds, and you know how people who are depressed stop taking in information from the world, right? In the same way, the addict can't really take in information from the family, and it's limited to the bottle. Yeah. So it's that shrinking of the world that happens when you're stuck in loops of rumination that you break by turning off the default mode network just for a while.
Yeah. So the mind basically becomes an echo chamber, and what you're doing is
exactly.
opening the door.
And you're bringing in fresh information, and that makes all the difference.
Yeah, I can see how that can help people. At the same time, it's been an instrument that's kind of been stigmatized. There's not a lot of therapeutic people that are openly talking about the fact that they use psychedelics. Why do you think that is? If it's obviously so powerful.
Well, it's threatening too. It shakes things up. It causes people to think for themselves.
Which is always dangerous, yes.
Always dangerous. I mean, that's what happened in the 60s. Psychedelics became very threatening to people in power in the United States especially. Timothy Leary said, kids who take LSD will not fight your wars or join your corporations. That was not an empty threat. It was true. They wouldn't. It was an amazing thing that a government had a war that they wanted to send their 18-year-olds off to. In the whole history of humanity, the 18-year-olds get up and go and they do what they're supposed to do. They stopped doing it. Yeah. And LSD had something to do with it. And the reason was that it does make you question whatever inherited hierarchies. It's fundamentally an anti-hierarchical substance. I mean, all these psychedelics. Whether it upsets hierarchies in the brain by dethroning the default mode network, but it also conceivably makes you question hierarchies in your world. Yeah. So that's part of it, and the government came down really hard on it. Plus, there were casualties. People were using the drugs in a very careless way. Mm-hmm. When LSD showed up in the West, it was just a molecule. It didn't come with rituals. It didn't come with shamans. Yeah. It didn't come with a history, tradition. And everybody was figuring out how to use it. And people were doing things they were putting in the punch and giving it to people who didn't know. I mean, can you imagine anything more cruel than to dose somebody without their knowledge? And so it was used in a very sloppy way. And yes, many people had profound experiences. Many people had really terrible experiences who weren't prepared. And as a result, you did have people, a handful of suicides. You had people ending up in psych wards. And these scare stories started getting around, and that led to a backlash that lasted, 30 years. But things are changing right now. I mean, I can testify based on the reception of this book that the mental health community is paying attention. They're really interested. I'm getting invited to talk to the American Psychology Association, the largest group of psychologists in America. Want a keynote address on this topic. I just did grand rounds at a psychiatric hospital. Mm-hmm. So things are changing. Mental health care has very few tools to deal with. I mean, SSRIs really don't help a lot of people. And there hasn't been any innovation in mental health care since the early 90s. Yeah. So there is a receptiveness that I did not expect to find. And I would not be surprised if psychedelic therapy is an accepted part of medicine within the next few years.
I was surprised about the success rate that we had with psychedelics. I thought it was with before it goes to trial, in order to become a prescription drug, it needs to go to all kinds of trials, and I think they had a success rate of 80%, which is
on several of the trials. Yeah, it's so far. I mean, these are preliminary trials. When they get bigger, we'll see. But it's very impressive. The effect size, which is how they measure this, also, it was off the charts for dealing with depression and anxiety among the dying. And the depression results were impressive too. And the smoking study was tiny, but really that also had 75-80% success rate. We've never seen that with smoking addiction is a very hard one to break.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
What does a psychedelic therapy session, what does that look like? For example, I would subscribe to such a therapy. I want to think something about myself. What kind of steps would I go through? What would that look like for me?
Well, it depends. I mean, the way it's being used in these therapeutic trials, I'll lay it out for you briefly. There are 3 steps. You're working with 2 therapists usually. One is preparation, where you explain, many people haven't ever used a psychedelic, what's going to happen, what to do if you see something scary. They give you what are called flight instructions, which really consists of telling you, whatever happens, surrender to it. Don't fight it. You get into trouble as soon as you resist the current. Your mind is taking you down the current, and you don't want to swim against it. And that's really important advice. Relax and let your mind float downstream, as John Lennon memorably put it. And in fact, they quote John Lennon. And then during the session, they sit with you, and they say very little. They don't want to, because of the suggestibility of the experience, they don't want to send you on this course or that. So they've moved to a place of being very non-interventionist for the trip. But they're there, extend a hand if you get freaked out, trust and let go. They'll have a little mantra that they'll remind you of if you're getting freaked out. Every now and then they'll say, so where are you now? Just to get a little information on where you're traveling to, and they'll write it down. And they just sit there meditating for most of the time. It must be kind of a boring job. Yeah. And then afterwards, you come back and you do this integration session where you tell the narrative that happened, and with the help of the therapist, you try to make sense of it. You try to extract some lessons that you could apply to your life and find meaning and connect what happened to your life story. And that's basically it. There's another approach to psychedelic therapy that was very common in the 50s, and I hope someone tries to bring back, which is to use low doses of LSD or psilocybin in a talking therapy, where you're sitting with your therapist talking, but you've been dosed beforehand, not to the extent you couldn't talk, that you want to just close your eyes, but to just access, to make you more open. And this was called psycholytic therapy, and it was done by psychiatrists in the 50s, and apparently had some very good results because people were undefensive, very open, and they would speak more freely.
And is that like a microdose kind of?
It's more than a microdose because you feel it. Yeah. It's definitely more than a microdose. Yeah. It would be in LSD. I think they'd give somewhere between 50 and 80 mics, and they found that would kind of lubricate people's ability to access their subconscious.
Interesting. Something you mentioned, the final step in this therapeutic approach would be the integration session.
Yeah, very important.
Something that, if I look at the underground scene in Holland, is usually missing in a big way, because people go to ayahuasca circles, they see the universe, and then they step into the car and go home. Yeah. And then they're sitting there with all these impressions and no one to talk to.
Yeah, I think that's a tremendous problem, and I think even in the best situation, integration is not done that well in my experience. It's very cursory, and needs more skill and more time applied to it.
Aren't you putting something together with Rick Doblin on this in April?
I'm not. Oh yeah, we have a session at Esalen that's called Psychedelic Integration, but like you, I misunderstood that to think it was about integration. No, it's about how to integrate psychedelics into society. I know.
Also very important.
Important, but confusing.
Yes.
Yeah. So I am doing that kind of thing. But no, I think integration is a really underutilized tool, and people are a little sloppy with it. I've had it work really well. It's very important. Frankly, I've gotten more integration from my wife than I have from my therapist. I mean, I would come home after I had one of these big experiences, tell the whole story, and we'd talk about it. And she knows me well enough to say, well, this probably is about that, and this is how this connects to this, and that's been really helpful. And writing about it helps too. Mm-hmm. You can integrate through writing. I think it's really important to write down your experiences. Yeah. But sometimes I just felt like it was very superficial. Like, I got that. You didn't tell me anything I didn't know. Yeah. But sometimes they can just reinforce things that you feel and just
Yeah, I feel sharing is one of the oldest ways of healing ourselves.
Yeah, it is.
And especially,
And articulating, saying things that you felt, as soon as it comes out of your mouth, it becomes more real, right?
yeah, people start even after sessions. You see people tearing up and talking
yeah.
about it, and yeah, it definitely brings a lot of emotion to it.
But I think we're going to move to a point where there are a lot of trained psychedelic therapists now emerging. There are training programs in the U.S., and that some of them, before it's legal, may have a practice integrating people, not dosing them, that just after someone has an experience, you could go to this special kind of therapist and work on your experience in 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 sessions.
Yeah.
And I think that could be really valuable.
Yeah, definitely.
People who know the territory.
Yeah.
And so I see that as something that's going to open up.
Yeah, I think you need also with these experiences, maybe we're talking about personal growth terms, but you need accountability. Because what I've been a victim of myself is having these perfect experiences, going into the world and thinking I've changed. I'm a different man now. But during the weeks or during the ways, you get bit in your old habits, and sometimes it's
That's why meditation is important. That's a way to keep it going. I think it can be.
Yeah.
And but it's true. There's so much inertial pressure forcing you back into the grooves of your life that it's very hard to resist. And it's also other people's expectations of you and how you're going to behave.
And
that has an enormous effect on us. And so to hold on to what you've learned takes real work. Because there are a lot of people pushing you back to the way you were.
And during some harder times in my life, I found the reflex of wanting to go back to this spiritual realm where everything was okay, and I've been a victim of that myself.
Well, you've taken plenty of refresher courses, however.
Yeah. Maybe I'm just addicted.
Something I have a question about, and maybe these two are related to another question I have. But the first thing I want to talk about a little is, and this is something I've heard people mess up horribly, is set and setting. They go into these experiences and they think, well, I can just do this at home, for example, and they find out that that's a very bad idea. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of set and setting?
Well, these were terms coined by Timothy Leary in the early 60s, and although the concepts were not his, the concepts were understood before that by a character I talk about at length in my book called Al Hubbard. And he was... I don't want to go into his whole story, but he was a very interesting character, an amateur who got very good at psychedelic therapy because he understood the power of set and setting. And he would do things like bring a rose into the treatment room, and he'd hold it up and he'd say to someone, "Hate that rose, hate it." And the rose in the minds would just kind of fall apart. And then he would hold it up again. He says, "Love that rose," and all the petals would come back together. Yeah. And so he was using the power of suggestion in a very shamanic way, actually. And he came to understand. And before that, people were administering psychedelics in hospital rooms, with fluorescent light and people with white coats. It was horrible. And people were freaking out sometimes. And he said, no, the room's got to be very cozy. It's got to have art. It's got to have beautiful music. So he figured this out. Leary codifies it with these terms, set and setting. So setting is the literal setting, the physical environment you're in. Set is the internal environment, your mindset, your expectations. Are you in a good place? Are you in a strong enough place to do this? Your intention would be part of the set. And these... set and setting matter greatly in psychedelics, much more than with other drugs. Cocaine will reliably do the same thing to you every time. Heroin, too. Psychedelics, you never know what you're going to get. And it is a product, not so much of the molecule, but of your mind and your whole gestalt at the moment you take it. Yeah. So that's what shamanism is, in a way, is a manipulation of set and setting, a very deliberate organization of set and setting. And a good guide is doing that too. And they paid a lot of attention to this even in the university trials. They don't do it in a white room. Even though they're in a hospital setting, they've set up a room that looks very cozy, and it has art and art books, and a lovely couch that you lie on. You're not in a hospital bed. And the lighting is lamp lighting, incandescent, not fluorescent. So they get it now. And then, of course, the music. And there's a whole conversation about what kind of music is best.
They scan people, right, on LSD?
Yes.
Have you ever been in an MRI? That's a scary experience.
Can't imagine that.
That must have been fun.
Those are heroic people willing to trip and get in an MRI.
I actually applied for a study in the Netherlands for psilocybin. It's a psilocybin double-blinded placebo test, and I assigned for going to an MRI 3 times to do this and do tests afterwards and see if.
So
I haven't been in there.
You haven't done it
I
yet?
applied to it, and
it's going to be really interesting. I mean, it's very important research, and I commend you for being willing to do it. I don't know if I mean, I just went in for a shoulder MRI once. I was freaked out.
It was actually funny. I
That
heard
was intimidating, yeah.
I heard, you know that Navy SEAL guy, David Goggins? I think he has a book called Can't Hurt Me. I think he's probably one of the toughest guys alive. But he had a fear of claustrophobia, and he just went into an MRI because he had access to it via a friend, and he conquered it. Just going in, kept me in the machine, and but I can imagine doing psychedelics being strapped down as well, because I don't think the MRI without any straps.
No, your head has to be very still.
Yeah, that's the thing.
So they may put you in one of those braces.
Could be. Well, that's okay.
Well, talk about set and setting. That's probably going to influence your experience pretty
Not
heavily.
a good way. Not a good way.
So about you were talking about music, very important.
Yeah.
And I think in a shamanic way, the Icaros, the sacred songs that heal you, are very important. Do you have any insights with your research about what music does to the brain while you're in a psychedelic state?
Well, my own experience in music was very profound, as I described at the beginning. And there was the wrong music was able to, put me down a path I didn't want to go. What's striking about music is how concrete it becomes, and that I think it is one of the most powerful influences on the experience. Because of synesthesia, if you have an input, and that's the only sensory input you're getting pretty much, right? Because you're blindfolded. So sound becomes more important. And then that sound starts generating space and becomes incredibly concretized. And so I think the music matters enormously. I don't think you want to hear words, although the Icaros are sung, but you don't know the language. And I think that helps. I think... And I heard a couple operatic songs or choral songs, but I didn't know what they were saying, because I don't think you want to be concentrating on meaning. Yeah. You really want the sensuality of music to come across. I think we have to wrap up.
Yeah.
Nee, sorry.
Are we?
De VRT staat in de wacht. Okay. En er zit een beetje een op- en afbouw overlap.
Dat snappen we. We zullen gaan afronden.
Okay.
All right.
What are we doing?
So the next guys are eager to set up their stuff. So the request was just to start wrapping this up.
Okay. Final questions.
Final questions. One question I have about experiences is that the set and setting question. If you look at your research, I've heard a lot about difficult trips, challenging trips.
Bad trips.
Bad trips where people encountered scary stuff, but at the same time, it always seems to be from a benevolent source, in the sense that you needed to confront this particular demon in order to grow. There seems to be no real malevolence there. It's like a good agent, if there was something like an alignment there. Is that something you subscribe to, or have you heard contradicting stories?
I think that the good guides and therapists I talk to don't like the term bad trip. They talk about a challenging trip, because if you integrate it properly, there's a lot to be learned from negative things that happen during the trip, and it can be terrifying. I mean, I think people should know before they do this that you can have one of the most frightening experiences of your life. The content of your own mind can frighten you more than anything in the world, which is an amazing thing to contemplate, right? But there is a value in that. There's a lot to be learned from it. The other flight instruction that's often offered, which I think is a really useful one, is if you see something terrifying, if you see a monster, don't try to run away. Step right up to it and say, what are you doing in my mind? What do you have to teach me?
Yeah.
And 9 out of 10 times it'll morph into something beautiful. Whereas if you try to run away, if you try to escape, it's just going to get darker and darker and darker. So you always have to move forward. You have to move toward what's frightening. And I found that advice really helpful. Just when I thought things were really going to get bad, I went toward it, not away from it. And then it would very often just get much, much sunnier right away. So, bad trips are terrifying. But I think in the same way, like nightmares are, nobody wants to have them. But sometimes those end up being the most profound trips of all.
A little scary can be good.
A little scary can be good.
Move into the fear. I think that's a good life lesson.
Move into the fear, And conquering fear, of course, is a big part of moving ahead in life, right? I mean, most of what keeps us from doing what we need to do is fear, right? I mean, between our ears is the big obstacle usually, and that obstacle is fear. And one of the things you confront on psychedelics are your fears, definitely.
Yeah. All right. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
You're very welcome. Thank you, guys. Thanks for sharing your stories, too.
We will put your book links in the show notes.
Thank you.
And we hope to have you back again for a
look
second
forward to that.
follow-up on your book.
All right, when you're up to 160 trips and I'm up to 10.
That will be in 3 years.
Cool. Yeah, good luck with your studies.
Yeah, well,
and your apprenticeship.
Yeah.
I'll be eager to hear more about that.
There's a book coming for you. I will send
Excellent.
I will send it to you.
Okay, I want to read it.
Yeah,
Definitely want to read it.
Listeners, catch you on the next one.
Thank
Ciao.
you. This podcast is sponsored by Synthesis, a legal and scientific-based psilocybin retreat experience in the Netherlands. Would you like to experience a psychedelic in a safe and carefully curated setting? Do you want to experience the transformations that you just heard in this podcast? Go to synthesisretreat.com.